So I'm going to try and use this. If it interferes with this, we'll have to punt. So can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. I don't know if anyone noticed it or was there, but also on Tuesday this week was Coyote America, another American icon. So it must be like Western Animal Week at CC. I was sorry I couldn't make it to that. I wanted to. Okay, so I have to start with a question. You don't have to raise your hand, but at least think of your answer in your head. How many people before tonight didn't really know that wild horses still existed? I gotta tell you, I was probably like 26 before I realized that wild horses were still around. And I mean real wild horses, not some captive herd that's carefully ministered to by some conservation group, but horses actually out there as wild as any other animal. How that happened is I was a reporter at the Gazette here, and the Bureau of Land Management, which manages all wild horses, sent a press release to us that on Saturday there was going to be a wild horse adoption. And you could come down and adopt a wild horse for $150. So I was like, there are wild horses and they're $150? This is a great story. I'm going to go down and learn a little bit more about this, write it up. And I went to the adoption site, which is at a prison in Canyon City, and they have these massive corrals where there were hundreds of wild horses just brought in from the range. And I waited around all day and I talked to the BLM employees, and I was ready to do a story on the adoptions, and 3 people came to adopt. And when they left, there were still hundreds of wild horses sitting in these corrals. And I asked the BLM manager there, so what happens to the rest of these horses? And he said, well, we put them in the holding system. And I said, what's the holding system? And he described it to me, and basically it is a series of ranches on the tallgrass prairie out in the Flint Hills of Kansas and Oklahoma. If you've never been to the Flint Hills, it's pretty gorgeous country. And it had been cattle country, but they essentially pay a per diem to put the horses out there until they find out what to do with them next. And they started putting them out there in the early 1990s, and they have never figured out what to do with them next. Now, where are these horses coming from? Well, there's only small plots within the West where wild horses are allowed to roam on federal land. And the Bureau of Land Management has set a target population. If it gets above that population in those scraps of land, they remove horses. And they remove them by rounding them up with helicopters. Then they truck them to the adoption sites where, generally speaking, they're not adopted. And then they go into the holding system. So today we have about 75,000 wild horses roaming free, which is fairly astounding and wonderful to think about, that there are 75,000 horses in America in 2018 that are free and roaming wild. We have about 50,000 in the holding system. And we have spent about $1 billion to put them there and keep them there. And there's no end in sight for that program. So when I learned that, when I came home from this first adoption, it really put this idea in my head that eventually led to this book. And that question is basically this: how the heck did we allow this to happen? How did we end up spending more than $1 billion on something that we as a country value because it's free? What does that say about us? How do we think about the wild, and how do we think about ourselves, and how did that get us into this mess? That's essentially what the book is about, but I want to make clear that it is not a foregone conclusion that we would end up with the situation we're in. We're not the only country with wild horses. In fact, we're not even the country with the most wild horses. I hear Argentina, yes. Namibia also, but the big one is Australia, which has 500,000 wild horses, which they call brumbies. But they don't have any government program to round up and store them. They don't have any laws against killing them, as we do. In fact, the government puts out pamphlets to help ranchers and other rural people best shoot wild horses if they become a nuisance. So, we have this current system because we wanted it, even though it's not what we wanted. And I will tell you a little bit about that. But first I want to give a little reading just to give you a sense of where these horses are. So, and I have to apologize, as you heard in the intro, I'm a newspaper journalist, which means that I have lots of practice typing, talking on the phone, giving readings. I do maybe once or twice a year, so if I'm a little rusty, be kind. Is the sound okay? Great. Just after dawn, on a frigid January morning, I clambered to the top of a rock spine rising 100 feet above the floor of a broad bowl of sage and alkali dust called Sand Springs Valley. I looked out across an unbroken expanse of nothing. Legions of gray brush spread out for miles towards dark mountains that looked like a dark tear across the winter sky. What was out there? Beyond the fog of my breath? Not much. Sand Springs Valley is one of those rare scraps of the American West that has changed little since the glaciers receded. There are no towns, no houses, not even a shack. I saw no fences, no power lines, no road signs, no roads. There were no blinking antenna spires, no cell towers, not even really a tree. All the bars on my cell phone had long since disappeared and the radio was static. Most of the mountains fencing in the valley were not just unvisited, but unnamed. I had bumped in on a dirt road that had turned to a gravelly track, then eventually shrunk to 2 ruts. Brush screeched along the belly of my truck, and the smell of crushed sage under the tires rose up as thick as incense. It was the kind of place where if you broke down, you could wait for days for help before just deciding to walk out on your own. I was in the middle of Nevada, in the heart of a region known as the Great Basin, a vast accordion of long valleys and jagged mountain ranges that runs down the interior west. Locals like to say what the West once was, the Great Basin still is. Open range, cattle rustlers, ghost towns, gold mines, and land so seamless you want to reach out and touch it to make sure it's not just a painted backdrop behind John Wayne. I was there for one reason. I wanted to see wild horses. Wild horses. Just saying the words sets off a stampede of images. Echoing box canyons and dusty blue mesas. Hooves flying through golden grass. The defiant scream of a rearing stallion. Heat waves rippling in the distance. Speed and strength and cliffs and cactus and dust and grit. Lonely places where big empty skies define the day and coyote songs define the night. Wild places forever beyond the grip of civilization. Wild horses. Even if you have never seen one, chances are if you grew up in the United States, you know what they mean. They are freedom. They are independence. They are the low-born outsiders whose nobility springs from living a simple life out there. In short, they are American, or at least they are what we tell ourselves we would like to be. If you think I'm laying it on a little thick, consider this. There are only 2 animals for which the United States has ever specifically passed laws to protect from harm. The first is the bald eagle. The second is the wild horse. And yes, unusual as it sounds, the United States still has wild horses. Real wild horses. Not just a few relics carefully curated in a national park, but tens of thousands. They roam free, cared for by no one, and controlled by no one, nearly as wild as the deer. Even in the 21st century, even when the wild is steadily disappearing, wild horses are not just surviving, but thriving. They are expanding. What a wonderful and strange thing. Today, wild horses still roam more than 31 million acres in parts of 10 western states. But very few people will ever see one, because wild horses live where we do not. The empty spots on the map, remote scraps of country, too dry or rocky or hot or all of the above to be of much use. They once roamed the whole West from the Great Plains to the Pacific, but they have been driven to the sharp-angled remnants of the West where there's still room for things to be wild. Rim rock, cedar breaks, salt flats, shale barrens. Almost any unwanted scrap where open space reigns and order and fences are scarce, you'll find them. Badlands, sage flats, even nuclear test sites and bombing ranges. These are the parts of America most people will only see from plastic airline portholes at 30,000 feet, where gradually the land shrivels and the grid of roads breaks down until it is just mountains and canyons crossed by a few strands of lonesome highway. Almost all of this country is located in the dry bowl of land between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. This collective group of relatively pristine remnants goes by many names. On my repeated visits, I began to refer to it simply as Wild Horse Country. The official government names of designated wild horse ranges in Wild Horse Country give some taste of the landscape. Granite, lava beds, Slate Range, Sand Canyon, Sand Basin, Sand Springs, Black Mountain, Bald Mountain, Dead Mountain. Just reading them makes you thirsty. They are names that map the history of people who came looking for something and only found nothing. They are what a gray-haired curator with dirty bifocals at a one-room Nevada History Museum described to me as nothing but miles and miles of miles and miles. They are names of want, failure, hideouts, last stands, and wind. Names of places that even the homesteaders we learn about in school sized up and then passed over. Stinking water, salt wells, rattlesnake, dogskin, cyclone rim, devil's garden, robber's roost, hard trigger, murderer's creek, dead man valley, confusion, Harvey's fear. It's not the land that horses chose. It's a land that was left to choose. Islands of desiccated emptiness that herds were pushed onto. Put together the patchwork where the horses are still found in the West, and you have an area about the size of Alabama, and the human population near zero. The legend of the wild horse? All that stuff about freedom and toughness which secured its place as an American icon? It is well deserved. Like nearly all Americans, the wild horse is an immigrant. And like many, it prospered through sheer grit. The herds on the land now are the descendants of painted war ponies that allowed a few thousand native warriors to hold off the industrialized American army. They are also the descendants of the ponies that the army used to chase down people like Crazy Horse and to corner Geronimo. They are the descendants of the Pony Express runners that whisked messages from the Mississippi to San Francisco in 10 days. And they are the cowboys' tireless sidekicks in the great cattle drives. Somewhere back in time, almost all of them somewhere back in time, they all descended from domestic horses. Many of them of Spanish blood, but likely many more from American stock. What you see on the range are the ones that got away, the refugees, the outcasts, the fugitives. Their toughness is legend. One newspaper account from the early days of California's gold rush told of a Mustang found trapped at the bottom of a well after 22 days. He was still doing fine. In San Francisco around that time, a Mustang rode 5 days straight during an endurance exhibition. In 1897, the United States Bureau of Animal Industry sponsored a race from Wyoming to Illinois. Any horse and rider could enter. 2 brothers caught wild Mustangs off the pasture near where they lived, broke and saddled them, and 91 days later, with no horseshoes and no grain, they trotted across the finish line first. The only survivor of Custer's last stand was a Mustang named Comanche. He had been shot 7 times, not counting the arrow wound from a previous battle, and he lived for years afterwards, eventually developing a taste for whiskey in his old age. Officially, the Sand Springs Valley, where I had gone to see wild horses, gets just over 7 inches of rain a year. But on the ground, which is mostly rock and dust with thorny brush, it is hard to believe. There are no creeks, no ponds. The terrain is so flinty and remote that NASA once tested a Mars rover here. It is textbook wild horse country. The Bureau of Land Management estimated that hundreds of horses roamed in the valley. But in the dawn light, I saw nothing but a half-dozen distant dots. You would think a vast herd of horses would be easy to spot, especially with binoculars and in a wide, open, treeless plain. But the West is not always what you think, especially when it comes to wild horses. Like a lot of things that persist in both life and in legend, wild horse country is a heap of contradictions. The Intermountain West is the emptiest part of the country and also the most urban. It is the most traditional and also the newest. Here, ranches and strip malls are sometimes separated only by a few strands of barbed wire. The locals tend to see themselves as rugged individualists, and suspicion of the government runs deep. But no other place has as much federal control or receives as much federal money. The situation with wild horses, too, is a contradiction. They are truly wild and directly descended from the herds of the Old West. There is nothing phony about them. But they are also tightly controlled by federal bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., corralled by lawsuits, and directed by sheafs of government impact statements. The riders that have the tightest hold on them are often riders in federal budget bills. Suddenly I spotted them. A distant smudge of golden dust bloomed in the gray brush. Then, cutting in and out from the dawn light, glints from a helicopter rotor. I thumbed the focus of my binoculars and saw the white bubble of the helicopter cockpit. It cut low over the ground, bent forward, tail up, like a patrolling dragonfly. It turned and dove and turned. In the jostling circle of the binoculars, I saw dark dots rise out of the sage. First one, and then many. A herd of horses. They were galloping across the plain, flat out in a long line, kicking up a mane of sunlit dust. I counted 32, backs rippling with muscle, coats shining in the dawn light, stringy manes flapping like banners as they flew over the thorny brush. The BLM usually justifies roundups by saying horse herds have gotten too big and are eating down the range to nothing. It's a common refrain in the agency that there are too many horses and they have to be removed before they starve. Because of this, I expected to see bedraggled wraiths in my binoculars. I thought life on such a harsh range with so little feed would leave the horses as craggy as the desert. But as the lead mare ran, I could see how sleek and glossy black she was. She had full muscles and deep, bright eyes. Two horses behind her were dappled gray with long, light manes. The group galloped with the grace of a herd you might see in an old Marlboro ad. Some were the color of old bourbon or chocolate. Some were like honey in the light. Others had white blazes on their faces. Horse people have names for these colors, but I should probably tell you now, I am not a horse person. I have never owned any horses and only rode a dozen times or so long ago at summer camp. I never read Black Beauty or dreamed of riding away on a stallion. I don't know anything about conformation or breeding. I could not appreciate a fine, abundant cannon or a prominent, capable withers. I don't even really know what withers are. I wanted to learn about wild horses not because I love horses, but because I love wildness. I love the enduring simplicity of life unbound. I love the parts of the West that remain untamed. That is what brought me to wild horse country. Part of me just wanted to know that that segment of the world still existed. I also came because I wanted to know how wildness on such a scale could persist at a time when everything seems increasingly penned in. How so many horses can live free when so much wildlife is threatened or disappearing, and what their existence said about the future of the West and about us. The horses galloped nearer. The shining white helicopter seemed to be right on top of them. It dodged left and right, low over the sage like a border collie, kicking up a halo of dust. The horses thundered towards the outcrop where we stood. Right beside the outcrop, the BLM had set up a large circular corral to trap the horses. Two long fences opened up into the desert from the corral like jaws, running at least 200 yards. Now the whine of the helicopter had grown until I could feel it against my chest. I put down my binoculars and watched the herd fleeing toward us. They crashed through the sage and jumped rocks. Their manes lashed their necks with the wind from the rotors. A mare stumbled and rolled head over tail before almost instantly rising into a run. In the end, it seemed almost too easy. The helicopter brought the herd right up against the steep side of our rocky spine, then flared to scare the horses into the wide jaws of the trap. The cowboys who had been waiting by the corral jumped from the sage, hollering and waving their hats. The chopper flared once more to scare all of the horses in, and the cowboys ran up and slammed the gate. Then it was over. The wild was gone, and only captives remained. I didn't think that seeing this would bother me, but in that moment I felt a deep sadness that I've only felt a few times in my life. The helicopter roared back over our heads and into the desert for another round. I stayed and watched all day as it made trip after trip. In 8 flights, the crew brought in 121 horses from a valley that had looked empty. As the sun slid low over the far side of the valley, the horses were pushed up a ramp into a waiting semi-trailer. The truck pulled away with a loud gasp and headed down one of those straight, empty, wild horse country highways. "Where will they go?" I asked one of the BLM cowboys. "They go for adoption," he said. "And what happens when no one adopts them?" I asked. "Then they go into the holding system," he said. "It's nice land, better than they have out here." So I'm hoping now that I've given you a sense of where they are now to give you a sense of how they got there. I'm hoping also that I can step away here and still have this work. Can everyone still hear me okay? Okay, great. Let's see if we can get this to work. Hey, all right. So here's where we are now. This is not too far from Elko. And like I said, every year helicopters are used to round up and bring in horses, which we store at great expense, and we have not figured a way out of this. We keep doing it. But let me take you back to where it all began. This is a really amazing part of this story because it begins, I think I need to be closer to this, which kind of defeats the purpose, right? The amazing thing about this story is it actually begins right here. And when I say right here, I mean literally on this ground where we are standing. And when I say the beginning, I mean we're going to go back 55 million years. So 55 million years ago was the dawn of the mammals. And that is when the very first primogenitor of the horse got started, right in this area where we are now, which at the time was covered in lush, kind of Costa Rica-like rainforest. This is Hyracotherium, also known by its other Latin name, Eohippus, or the dawn horse. Eohippus was about the size of a cat, which is kind of hard to imagine until you've held its jaw in your hand. This is from the Badlands of the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, where some of the shale formations are just packed full of the jaws of Eohippus. Eohippus was everywhere. If you imagine it like jackrabbits out on the plains, they were just covered the forest there. They were the dominant herbivore species. But what happened between 50 million years ago when they were small and everywhere, and 10,000 years ago when they disappeared from here, is that the rainforest also disappeared. Very slowly and gradually all over the earth. A planet that had been super forested started to dry out. Forests started to change to savanna and started to change to grassland. And when that happened, many species died out, but the wild horse did not. It was able to adapt to living on grass and living out in the open. And when it did, it got bigger. Its legs got longer. It got faster. It got larger eyes that moved farther and farther back on its head so that it could keep its head down and graze while still watching for anything that was going to come and try and eat it. And it also branched out into, in North America, a Serengeti of different horse species. You know, if you imagine all the ungulates in Africa now that live in the Serengeti, there are giraffes that browse the tops of the trees. There are impala that are small and especially fast. There's different sizes for different niches. The same thing happened over the last 50 million years in North America. We had all these branches of prehistoric horse species. All of them died out, except for the few that we have today. Most notably the horse, also the zebra, the donkey, and a couple donkey-like things that live in Eurasia and Africa. All of them spread from the original North American animal. So what happened 10,000 years ago? Because as we know, when we showed up, when the Spanish showed up, when Europeans showed up, there were no horses here. Okay, so after horses had spread to the rest of the world, they died out in the Americas. They died out somewhere around 10,000 years ago, which, by the way, is about the same time that human hunters showed up. And all of the big animals in North America disappeared at that time. Now, that's somewhat circumstantial, but I want to tell you another good story from nearby that adds some evidence. In about 2007, an anesthesiologist was having a nice new koi pond built in his backyard, right below the Flatirons in Boulder. And the workers were digging, and then they suddenly unearthed spear points. But not just any spear points. They were gorgeous, fluted spear points that were about this big, like dinner plate big. And they called the oncologist and said, maybe you should check this out. And he was amazed and said, I'm going to go down to CU and show them these spear points that we found. And so they called down to the anthropologists down at CU. And of course, the poor, long-suffering anthropologist at CU, whenever any Boy Scout finds a pointed rock, he gets a call. But he's like, well, okay, this is in the neighborhood, not very far from my office. I'll go check it out. And what they found was one of the finest collections of Clovis points, these first human culture that came to North America ever found. And the oncologist was really excited that this had come out of his koi pond. And he said, what more can we find out about these? You know, we know the date, we likely know the culture that they were made by. You know, what else can we do? And the anthropologist said, well, we could DNA test them, but that would be expensive and might not turn anything up. And the oncologist said, I have the money. Let's test them. And they were covered with horse. And then the horse came back. The horse came back with the Spanish and very quickly spread. I want to just mention that this period of about 10,000 years that the horse was gone, in the whole 55 million year history of the wild horse in North America, that 10,000 years is equivalent. If the 50 million years was a day, the horse would have thrived in North America right until about 11:59 and 47 seconds. And then it would have been gone until 11:59 and 58 seconds, at which point it comes back with the Spanish. Now the Spanish brought the horse in, and we probably all remember the stories of how easily the Spanish conquered native civilizations because they were so impressed by their horses. It was their secret weapon. You could ride in to a Mayan city of 30,000 and conquer it with 50 men. And it didn't take the native tribes long to want these horses and to get these horses. And where that mostly happened was in New Mexico, and mostly right around Santa Fe. The Spanish tried to establish a base there, and repeatedly the Apaches, the Utes, the Navajo, came in and stole their horses. And of course, once you have some horses, it makes it that much easier to steal more horses. And so this positive feedback loop happened over a couple hundred years where Santa Fe became like this fountainhead where they would get raided and ask Mexico to send up reinforcements, and then the Apaches, the Shoshone, the Navajo would come in and just take them. And then they could trade them north and east and west, and there are these clear trade routes where horses with Spanish brands were later seen by explorers up in British Columbia. They were almost the perfect trade good, right? Because they're not only extremely valuable, but they transport themselves. And so within just a few generations, the entire the cultures of the West, collective sigh in the room from these poor bureaucrats who had answered this question from stupid neophytes like me over and over and over. And they're like, sir, mountain lion is not big enough to kill a horse. Mountain lions can't hunt in the open desert where these animals are found. This is not even worth talking about. Please sit down. And so I did. For 2 years, 3 years, I sat down and didn't say anything. But then, as part of my research, I started reading all this other mountain lion biology research that had happened. Like since the 70s, 80s, 90s, all this stuff where, various learned biologists had spent several years in the field somewhere in the middle of Nevada. And inevitably, they're studying something else. They want to study X about the horses. And they write up their paper, and they have to note somewhere in there, we studied X, however, X kept getting interrupted because several of the horses we were studying got eaten by mountain lions. Huh. I was like, oh, okay. And I kept finding it again and again and again and again. And so I finally went out with one of these biologists who had seen this for years to really learn how it works. So how do mountain lions do it? In the treeless plain, with big, fast horses that are, easily 5, maybe even 10 times their weight. Well, they do it the same way every time. And it's a scene that you have seen on Wild America a million times. Okay, imagine a valley in Nevada that's 100,000 acres. And in it, there are like 3 springs, each of which are an acre in size. All of the horses are going to go to one of those springs. Now, the mountain lions do not eat wild horses all year. In fact, they only eat them from about May until about June, when they have their foals. Mom takes the foals to the spring, mountain lion eats the foals. And there are places where that dynamic is controlling the wild horse population, and it has been for we don't know how long. The interesting thing that's going on is the BLM's job is to take care of the horse problem. And so wherever there are herd areas, sprinkled across the West where there's no population growth, they don't even pay attention to them because they're too busy, scheduling the helicopter over here. They don't know why on this one mountain range in Arizona, the horses have been about 60, a herd of 60 for as long as anyone can remember. And so there's this dynamic where they can't find the solution because they're not looking. Now, how many places could you actually use mountain lions? I don't know. I think that it's probably really thorny, and there's all sorts of ranchers that don't want mountain lions anywhere near their herds. But what I've tried to argue to the BLM is that the first thing one needs to do is look at all of these areas and see where could we do this. Maybe we could control half of our population of horses using mountain lions. If we did that, we would save $50 million a year. Not only that, money is important, but in the federal world, $50 million is not all that much, but we could preserve places where the horses are truly wild. So when I was thinking about this, Obama was in office, and you could reasonably think that the government was going to work towards doing things maybe a little bit better. I don't think that in his 3 or 4 terms Trump is going to do this. So it's an open question whether any of this will ever happen. But I really think that if we want to preserve both the horses and the wild, and the reasons that we preserve them in the first place, that it's probably the only way. I'm going to stop there, and please, if you have questions, I'd love to answer them, but also if you have homework, I totally understand. But if you sneak out, I'll be okay with that. So thank you guys very much. Can I answer any questions for anyone?
I have a question.
Please.
So the you can't kill horse law.
Yes.
Is that makes no sense to me. But so I can understand, the romanticized image that they have, but when it comes to deer or
right.
Buffalo or
so
else,
we manage them way more like endangered species than we do like wildlife.
Right.
Right.
So I'm not familiar with the rationale or the.
And I think it was really modeled on, so Endangered Species Act is 1978. This is 1971. And I think it was really modeled on that. Like, let's come up with a big federal solution. Ranchers that live in wild horse country think this is crazy. Because what they say, and they're not completely right, but what they say is like, we used to handle this just by like local roundups and you would get a county permit and like, it didn't cost nobody nothing. And that's true, but they didn't have enough oversight that they had a sustainable population. So I think the federal is crazy, you're right. I don't know how you go back to the local. You know, like why don't we manage them like we do bighorn sheep in Colorado?
Right.
Where you're allowed to hunt, but they're also managed and conserved. We're not there. And I don't know how we get back there. Please.
Dave, realistically, if I go out and round up a Mustang or I adopt one, if it's an older one, is it that impossible to tame? Or if it's a younger one, do I have a better opportunity?
Do we have a horse trainer here?
Yeah.
So generally speaking, I hate to say this because I'm talking from abject ignorance. Younger is better.
Okay.
Younger is better.
That's what I thought.
And certainly there's no shortage of young Mustangs out there. The other sticking point is they're small. Like nature shapes them to be smaller, we breed them to be bigger.
Right.
And so that's very unattractive to your average horse rider. And so it's, you know, it's sort of like putting a bunch of Yugos on
Yeah,
the
well,
lot.
I don't know that much about horses, but I just want to have a good horse. You know?
Yeah.
So I'm not prejudiced against the little ones.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, so the people that are the champions of these horses, what they'll say about them is because they're influenced by natural selection, they're smarter, more disease resistant, and more injury resistant.
Right.
I mean, they're extremely tough, and the stories you hear from people who used them in the past, whether it's the Comanches or the cavalry that tried to chase them, are pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Please.
May I answer his question?
Please.
The Mustang Heritage Foundation has a program where they let professionals and semi-professionals work with the Mustangs, and then they have to show them and compete with them in different classes to show their level of training.
And there's also
And then they are offered for sale.
and then there's
They
also a
have them
prison,
right up in-
several prison programs that at least
Yeah, but
halter
the other
train
one-
these guys.
Yeah, but this is right up in Fort
Yeah,
Collins. They
yeah.
do it every year.
It's a cool program. They even televise it sometimes, the competition.
So.
It's sort of like America Got Talent from Mustangs.
I didn't know about that. That's really interesting, yeah.
Anyone else? Please.
Well, when I used to live in California, I used to go to Reno, Nevada for spring, play golf. Well, a couple of years while I was there, there was newspaper articles about the wild Mustangs were wandering into the residential area.
Yeah.
And it was like they developed, they weren't afraid of humans anymore.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were getting killed and hit by cars.
Yeah, it's like the deer in Skyway.
Yeah. So, you know, that's a whole different situation.
Right. Well, and those horses are technically not wild because they're not on federal land. They're on like state land and in the suburbs, and so they have their own rules, and so it's a really tough management problem. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. If you want to come up, please ask me. I'll stick around. And let's see. So there's books here. I think so. What's the deal with books?
You give them away.
Oh, okay, because I think this is on my last